Years ago, I found myself living in Tromsø, northern Norway, where I had my own apartment. At that time, my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer. My parents lived in southern Norway, far from the nearest hospital, which was burdened with a long waiting list for cancer treatment. However, the hospital in Tromsø could admit him immediately. Without hesitation, I welcomed them into my home during his treatment. As his treatment concluded, a couple of my parents' friends decided to visit them in Tromsø for a few hours. My father insisted that I chauffeur them around the town, a task I found utterly unappealing. Determined to do the right thing, I offered my parents the full use of my apartment for the day to entertain their friends, while I opted to rent a car and embark on a road trip up north. The idea of adventure called to me, and I desperately needed to distance myself from the suffocating atmosphere at home. My mother supported my decision, deeming it a splendid idea. Yet my father erupted in anger, demanding I drive them instead. He loathed the idea of having to drive himself. Just the day before, he had expressed jealousy over my driving skills, his resentment palpable. His anger only fueled my resolve to escape on this road trip, to carve out some much-needed space between us. A few hours later, my father stomped into the living room, his face flushed with frustration. "Your mother cancelled the visit," he announced, his voice edged with accusation. "She doesn't want you driving alone." His words seemed absurd, given my experience of navigating the winding roads of Tromsø for the past 5 years as a truck driver. His eyes burned with anger, and he launched into a tirade, pointing a finger at me as if I were the architect of his disappointment. "If you hadn't insisted on that road trip," he barked, "your mother wouldn't have cancelled. You could have driven us around Tromsø." His tone was sharp and unkind, each word a jab that cut through the air. But the truth revealed itself like a hidden chapter in a novel later on. It was all a fabrication. My mother hadn't cancelled anything. My father had orchestrated the entire deception. He had purposely derailed the visit after I refused to act as their chauffeur, concocting a story to cover his tracks. Growing up in our household, manipulation was as familiar as the ticking of the kitchen clock. My father had a knack for bending us to his will, expertly pressing the emotional buttons that triggered the deepest guilt. I remember a particular Sunday morning when my mother expressed her desire to attend a lively Pentecostal church service. My father, however, insisted on the solemnity of the Catholic Mass. Despite his wishes, my mother decided to go to the Pentecostal church. Before she left, he clutched his chest dramatically, his face contorting with faux pain, and warned her of a looming heart attack, claiming he was gravely ill. We came back from the service to find him not in distress as he'd predicted, but rather out enjoying a leisurely shopping spree at the mall, later sipping coffee at a bustling cafe. Another incident etched in my memory involved a supposed medical emergency. My parents sat me down, their faces drawn and serious, telling me that my father had fallen dangerously ill. They insisted they must return to Tromsø immediately to consult with his doctor or risk dire consequences. The urgency in their voices was palpable, but as reality unfolded, it became clear this was a fabricated tale. Their urgent departure was merely a convenient excuse to leave my wife and me sooner than planned, as they were displeased that I was placing my wife's needs above their own. Growing up in an environment like this meant constantly being on edge, always scanning for danger. It felt like walking on a tightrope, not knowing when a sudden gust would knock you off balance. Whether their words were truth or deceit was a daily gamble, a game of Russian roulette that kept you hyper-vigilant. Living in such a state of perpetual fight or flight, compounded by the searing betrayal of sexual abuse and the betrayal of being drugged by your own parents, it was no wonder that life felt like an uphill battle, each step heavy with the weight of survival. How did I navigate through those dark times? And why can I genuinely say today that life is fulfilling and my past no longer haunts me? The turning point was my faith in Jesus. You might be expecting me to say that by accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior, He'll miraculously erase the scars of such a troubled history. Let me share how this journey unfolded for me. To be honest, the typical Christian explanation of passively accepting Jesus as Lord and Savior, joining a church denomination, and living according to their doctrines and dogmas for the rest of one's life hasn't resonated with me. For me, what truly made a difference was embracing faith in Jesus. Not just any faith, but the biblical concept of faith. You might wonder, isn't faith just faith? What's the distinction? Jesus, Paul, and the apostles were all Jews immersed in a Hebraic Jewish culture. When they spoke of faith, they referred to an understanding deeply rooted in their traditions, one that was never passive, but always active. For instance, when Paul instructed the jailer to have faith in Jesus to be saved, he wasn't merely suggesting a belief in Jesus dying for sins. Instead, he was urging, listen to what Jesus said and demonstrate your belief by following his teachings. To Paul and the apostles, having faith in Jesus meant not just hearing his words, but acting upon them. What did Jesus instruct us to do? According to the Bible and the Gospels, Jesus directed us to turn back to the Torah, the law of Moses. So, if you truly have faith in Jesus, you consciously choose to adhere to Jesus' teachings on the Torah, actively living out those principles in your daily life. When I made the decision to embrace faith in Jesus and live my life according to the laws of Moses, as outlined in the Torah, I felt a profound healing wash over me, soothing the deep scars etched by my past. While the memories of those times remain vivid and the emotions tied to them linger, their grip on me has loosened. The haunting shadows of being sexually, mentally, and emotionally abused by both my parents and the sting of rejection from my brother are woven into the fabric of my history and identity. Yet, they no longer define me as a victim. Instead, they mark me as a survivor, resilient and unbroken, freeing me from the chains of my past. The strongest testament to this transformation is my current act of courage, sharing my story openly on platforms like YouTube and Facebook. Once, the mere thought of such exposure would have sent shivers down my spine, filled with fear and shame. For years, I carried the belief that my experiences were something to hide, a source of disgrace. But through living by the Torah, I realized the truth. It was not my fault. The blame lay entirely with my parents and my brother, who turned their backs on me. I have no reason to feel ashamed. This revelation fuels my resolve to share my journey, because during those harrowing times, hearing a story like mine would have been a beacon of hope. Knowing that someone else had walked through the fiery trials and emerged not just intact, but thriving would have been the lifeline I needed. By opening up about my past, I aim to provide that same hope to you. I want you to know that survival is possible and thriving is within reach, as I extend my story to offer you the courage to persevere.